Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome, everybody. Today we get to chat with Peter Kageyama. He is a third-generation Japanese American, a best-selling author, and an urbanist. And he's a former senior fellow with the Alliance of Innovation. And as a writer and speaker, he's written 4 nonfiction books on cities and urban development. So, we're going to have him back on the show for that. You all know us here at Big Blend. We've got our Parks and Travel show, and we love all of that. But he's also a fiction writer, and his second book in the Kats Takemoto series is out. It is called MIDNIGHT CLIMAX. The first one is called Hunter's Point, and I encourage you to go to his website, peterkageyama.com. Welcome, Peter. How are you?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Well, I heard that, you're in St. Petersburg, Florida, beautiful area, and
Yes.
It's a little cloudy today, so that might be more like San Francisco's weather where your book is set.
Weather, impacts the way we think and feel about cities, and some weather is far more dramatic than others. And I think San Francisco has some of the most dramatic weather in the United States. So yeah, hard pressed to live up to that, but yeah.
Oh yeah. Always wear a jacket, right?
Always wear a jacket, even in summer. Yes.
Exactly. But it's a beautiful city. And, when we came back to this country from South Africa, it was like one of the first places I wanted to go was San Francisco. And, there's so much history, and just the history of, we go back to, the Spanish going through with the Presidio, and there's the nuclear history, which that connects over to your family history too, with, also World War II, and just so much cultural history as well. It's amazing.
I mean, San Francisco just doesn't look and feel like pretty much any other city in America. It is very unique that way.
Yeah, the closest I would say would be Cape Town in South Africa. And even that's completely different. Just that coastal port cities, and port cities always have something going on that we shouldn't know about, but we want to know about, right? And so
they're gateways. Yeah. They feel like they connect us to someplace else. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, can we start at the beginning with the series, with Kats Takemoto series, with Hunter's Point? So kind of give us the backdrop. Obviously, San Francisco, as we were saying, but this is going back a few generations, right? So give us a little bit of a backdrop and introduce us to Hunter's Point for those who haven't read it yet.
So Kats Takemoto is a nisei, a second generation Japanese American. He's a private detective, and the stories are set in San Francisco starting in the late 1950s. Hunter's Point takes place essentially in 1958, which is the height of the Cold War, which would, of course, go on for another 25 years. But, it was raging at the time. And Kats is a former soldier. He served in the U.S. Army in the 442nd, which was a very famous combat regiment that served with incredible distinction over in Europe. He comes back, and the story is, like many of the Japanese Americans who tried to reintegrate into society, he found, he got an education and decided what he wanted to do. And oddly enough, he becomes a private detective. That's part because stories about, accountants are probably not as interesting. But apologies to the accountants out there. Weirder stuff happens to private detectives, which I guess lends a nice platform for telling these kinds of stories.
Yeah, I like this. We actually interviewed a undercover FBI guy in San Francisco who's a musician. He came on the show because Donovan Plant and the New Leafs is his band name. And, so, halfway through the interview, I'm all like, I love your music, but can we ask about this? Did you have to wear a wig? But the private investigator side of it is crazy. And then when you open up the book of MIDNIGHT CLIMAX, wow. It's a little hot and steamy and then crazy. There's a pace that moves and moves, and you're like, what's going on? What do you mean there's other people watching people? What's going on here? And so this kind of touches in with the whole thing about the CIA weren't they testing like acid and things like that on people?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's been pretty well, covered and documented over, this last generation when it became public knowledge. that the CIA was doing mind control, thought control experiments from like the 1950s into the 70s. They believed that, the Russians and the Chinese were experimenting with psychotropic drugs, LSD and
Oh.
stuff like that. And they thought they could use that to create either, again, read people's minds, control them, turn them into sleeper agents. There was all kinds of crazy stuff that they thought was part of the so-called science at the time. And that operation was actually called MK Ultra. And many of your listeners might have heard of that because it's become a famous sort of trope that is used in a lot of stories because, again, it was so crazy because it was real. And the title of this second book, Midnight Climax, actually comes from another CIA operation that was actually a subset of MK Ultra, where they were actually using brothels and prostitutes to lure Johns in to secretly dose them and then observe them and try to get them to do stuff. And this occurred in two American cities. It occurred in New York City and San Francisco. And so
Wow, I didn't know New York.
yeah,
Huh.
when I first read about that, I thought, holy crap, that is such a crazy background.
Yeah.
I have to use that as a a setup for a story. And
I love that you say Johns too, because that goes back to that era as well. You know,
the
they're luring the Johns in, for
John's
40
in,
bucks. Yeah.
yeah,
Look, here it is.
the
Hey,
clients.
actually back then that was a little bit more money than what 40 bucks is now. I don't think we can even buy, two cups
Yeah,
of
I
coffee.
didn't, kind of, just the economies of the day. It's like, what would have been, a cup of coffee or the price of a prostitute? Yeah, that's the kind of question you should ask Google. Yes.
Oh my gosh, your Google history has got to be so cool.
Yeah.
Prostitution, drugs, the
Oh, yeah.
CIA. How
Well,
much is a
actually, yeah.
prostitute back then?
Well, my third book, I won't tell you exactly what's going on with that, but yeah, you're right. If a fiction writer's, search history could be a strange thing. It's like, you're either
Yeah.
a spy, a terrorist, a pervert, or a writer. Yeah, I guess
Or a
maybe that's
murderer.
what I
Yeah.
want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was interesting, just how you started the book. It's like, okay, I'm in. This is getting wild. But didn't they, with this whole experimenting thing, didn't they do this to Charles Manson? I don't know if I heard that right. I was
Some
listening to
people
some
believe
podcast.
that, Manson was I guess you could call him a guest of the state numerous times in the 1960s, I guess, even from the late 50s, if I remember some of my history correctly. So it's possible he was experimented on. I don't know too much, about his particular
Yeah.
history. But if it was happening in other places, it is entirely possible. And he was on the West Coast.
Hmm.
I do know a little bit of the history. Did you know, for instance, that Charles Manson was in San Francisco during the Summer of Love in 1967?
See? Ooh, that's
Yeah,
creepy, isn't it? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. There's so many stories about him, like people knowing his people and all of that. So I wonder though if he was experimented on, if that
Who
messed with
knows?
his brain, who knows,
Yeah,
right? But our government has done a lot of experimenting on people, especially people of color over the years. Women of color
yeah,
have been experimented on and
yeah,
operated on without them knowing what was really happening. So it's kind of interesting that
yeah.
governments do that, don't you
There's
think?
a
It's
sad
kind of
history.
freaky.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, we hope it's still history. Like,
we
you
hope.
know,
Yes.
yeah, it's kind of a freaky thing, but let's go into Cats and the whole series. What
Hmm.
spurred you to even start a series? You're going from, hey, let's
Yeah.
take a walk in the park and
Yeah.
make our
City guy.
cities beautiful to,
Right.
hey, we've got murder and
Well,
drugs and brothels and stuff going on.
honestly, a big part of it was COVID. I finished my fourth book on cities. It was actually an updated, expanded version of my original book. It's called For the Love of Cities Revisited. It was the 10-year anniversary edition of that. And I'd kind of gotten back into the writing mode. And part of it is, I was reading some really interesting stuff. In fact, the book that I credit most with sort of firing my imagination around this was by a guy named Daniel James Brown. The book was called Facing the Mountain, and it was this nonfiction account of the Japanese American experience during World War II. And some listeners may know Brown from his most famous book, which is called The Boys in the Boat, which is about the 1936 Olympic rowing team from Washington. In fact, they just made a movie about it. It just came out a couple of months ago. So he wrote this other story or this other book about the Japanese Americans during World War II. And I read it and I was like, oh my God, this is all the stuff that my father never talked about. My father was a nisei, second generation Japanese American, full-blooded, Japanese, although he was born in San Francisco. He was interned along with my grandparents and his two sisters. And this was part of the family history that was not really discussed. Like many of his generation, they didn't want to talk about it. So I had to learn about all this stuff by reading this book by, Daniel James Brown. And it's just amazing stuff. And it kind of, I thought, well, again, you think that would be a really interesting background for a character. And you start thinking about where would that character live? It's like probably San Francisco, which is the epicenter of sort of the Japanese American community. Yeah. And it started to build on that. And it's like, one thing led to another. And it's like, well, I'm not doing the other, sort of the city stuff because it was still COVID. So the imagination runs wild, I guess, in sort of strange circumstances like that. And I'm very glad it did.
And going into your family history, that has to be a little tough, and because at that time too, like you were saying, it's kind of that quiet history. It's and even from all levels, and different sides of the war, people just kind of kept, the survivors of it kept quiet and moved on. It seems like people that were really faced with the worst part of the war.
And, again, the Japanese American community they kind of said, we don't talk about it, move on. And it was not exactly, a shining moment in, U.S. history. So oftentimes it's kind of glossed over. A lot of people tell me it's like, I really didn't learn about that in school. Some of them learned about it later in life. Sadly, there's lots of, instances like that in our history that are just either painful, embarrassing, just really hard to fathom and hard to deal with. So we tend to sort of gloss over them or just pass over them. But it was a great way for me to reconnect with my Japanese heritage. I'm half Japanese. My mom, which is a kind of unusual pairing at the time, and I used that actually in my story because Kats meets a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio named Molly in the first book, Hunter's Point. And my mother was a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio who happened to be named Molly. So there's there's some family stuff in there in trying to make a good story. But I thought, all right, this would be kind of fun. My dad was never
the wild Irish rose had to persist. Yeah, bring the wild Irish rose in. Molly's a good name for that. Hey, you had to have a Molly in there because you're also talking about drugs. So hey,
oh well, there you go.
Hey, good tie in there. I don't know anything. I wouldn't even know what Molly looks like. That's how bad I am at this. But, well, coming to the States, I had a rude awakening about what drugs were. Like,
Really?
there's pot and marijuana and weed and all that kind of stuff. That's normal. Like, that's a normal thing.
It's legal in more than half the states now. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of a normal thing. And then here, like, I didn't know, half of what was going on. And I know that you have a musical background too. And so when we got here and we were living in Southern California and a band and I found out half the band was high all the time. And I didn't understand why did your personality change so fast? Oh, meth makes you think that people are spying in your bedroom.
Yeah.
Oh, can't have you as a drummer anymore. So
pot seems very benign compared to a lot of stuff that's out there now. So yeah.
Well, I don't know. From what I've heard, it's a little different now too. I mean, I grew up in South Africa, and that was kind of a, it's part of the grass.
Okay.
But it's so interesting to get into all of this, because also when you look at Japanese American history, we do cover military history a lot on the show. It's interesting. And I can understand the fear from the American side, that when, oh my gosh, because the Japanese, quite frankly, were badass, in regards to war and military. They've always been amazing. Your culture's good at it, so I think there was a huge amount of fear. But at the same time, if you look in history, the Japanese have been a huge part of our military protecting this country too. So did you dig into that part as you're getting into the history?
Well, certainly the Japanese American combat team, the combat unit, the 442nd, was an experiment at the time, because remember, in 1942, Roosevelt signs the executive order that says all the Japanese and people of Japanese ancestry on the west coast of the United States have to be moved out of there. Basically, like 100-mile wide swath from Washington all the way down to the southern tip of California, which basically sets up these internment camps. And then by 1943, they start realizing, wait a minute, there's a lot of healthy young men in these camps that we would like to, that would, probably, if given the opportunity, they would want to serve. And they did. So this sets up this interesting juxtaposition of these guys volunteering essentially out of prison camps for the U.S. Army. And, the vast majority of them they were required to sign a loyalty oath, which was odd because no German American or no Italian American had to sign a loyalty oath, but almost all these young men did. And then they went over to Europe because they weren't allowed to serve in the Pacific, which kind of made sense, in part because there was some worry that's like, well, they might see their Japanese ancestors and decide they're more Japanese than American, which was kind of BS. But the real reality is that a Japanese face even in an American uniform, you could have been shot by your own, side just because you looked like the enemy. It's like, so that kind of made sense. So these guys served in Europe, and they served with incredible distinction. The 442nd was and remains the most decorated unit in U.S. Army history. They called it the Purple Heart Brigade because these guys had something to prove. And I guess maybe the bit of that samurai spirit or something like that kind of came through it, because these guys were incredibly brave, and sometimes I guess even incredibly stupid, they said, because they felt like they had more to prove because of the color of their skin.
Yeah, I can imagine, Wow, a lot. So you've had to do a lot of history, like a lot of research to get this all together, because you're going back in time. And then at the same time, you've got to know, like, okay, drugs and murder and stuff,
Well, you watch enough television, you've seen tons of drugs and murder by the time you're an adult. More of it was weaving together the actual history and stuff that really happened. How do you use that as an element of a fictional story? How do you use real people as part of telling a fictional story? For instance, in the first book, Hunter's Point, Jimmy Stewart and Jack Kerouac are characters.
Sweet.
In the second book, slightly lesser known in some ways, but a guy by the name of Ken Kesey, who famously goes on to write One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Mm-hmm.
He's a young writer in the second book, Midnight Climax. So
very cool.
Trying to integrate real people and and make it part of a hopefully what I think is a really good story.
That's fun. I mean, and you're an amazing writer. What's it like going from writing nonfiction into fiction?
It's very different. Very different.
It's
if you'd asked me, sort of, 3 or 4 years ago, do you feel like a writer? I said, well, I'm more of a speaker who occasionally writes, because 4 books in 10 years was not exactly Stephen King sort of prolific. But after Hunter's Point came out, and I thoroughly enjoyed the process, and it was very, very different. I kind of embraced that idea. Yeah, I guess maybe I am a writer, and now I absolutely say yes, I am a writer, and I really love that. And it is very different. It's a very different mindset. To write nonfiction requires a certain type of research. You go to places, you observe, you take notes, and this. For fiction, it's like almost you dream up this like wild scenario, and it's like, well, then how would they do that? And then you sort of research how something like that becomes possible, or like what was happening in 1959, in 1960 that you could possibly use. So it's a different process, but I do love it. I am absolutely loving it.
Do your characters talk to you?
Not in sort of a crazy kind of way. No, I don't hear the voices in my head.
Everyone, Peter's not doing the psychedelics, by the way.
Yeah. But I do feel like I've come to know them, and there's certain things, and my wife, who's also my first reader. I said in my dedication to the second book, she's my first reader in all things,
and illustrator.
And the illustrator of the books, by the way. Yes, she's an amazing artist. She's an architect. So she's one of those old school architects who can actually draw. So she's made some, did some amazing illustrations for the books. But after a while, you kind of get to know the characters. And there's even been instances, where she would read something, she go, that doesn't seem like Kats, or that Molly wouldn't say that, or Shig would do this. It's like, and so I think she's come to know them as well. And that's actually kind of cool. So yeah, not quite speaking to me in those voices yet, but they do I do think about them as almost sort of real incarnations in some ways. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Shig. We've we've touched on Molly and Kats, but Shig, their friend.
Yeah, he was a real guy, Shigeyoshi Murao. So Shig was a Japanese American. He was interned at the Minidoka camp up in Idaho. He served during World War II. He was with the Military Intelligence Service, which was the translation group, the translators, Japanese to English, English to Japanese. And in the mid-50s, he goes to San Francisco and he gets a job at City Lights bookstore. And if any of you have been to San Francisco, you've probably been or you've heard of City Lights. It's this very famous bookstore in the North Beach neighborhood. It is still there. It was known as sort of a radical outlier artistic bookstore. It was the bookstore made famous by all the beat poets and the beat writers, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and those folks. And Shig was the longtime manager of that store. And he became kind of famous because he had the distinction of selling a copy of Allen Ginsberg's book, Howl, to an undercover police officer, which led him to getting arrested for selling obscenity. You can imagine in 1957, this book was deemed, this poem was deemed obscene, and he was taken to court. And so there's a big, trial. Of course, ultimately, the First Amendment, free speech wins, and Shig becomes sort of a hero of the, First Amendment free speech kind of movement. And he kind of basked in that. And he was one of those sort of central connectors in the artistic scene there in North Beach for decades. And it was fun to use him to make him Katz's best friend. And again, he was a real guy. And he went through the same experience that Kats did of, internment and serving, in the military, and then having to be Japanese or Japanese American, in the post-war era, when I'm sure it was very hard to look like him, and walk the streets of this American city because, these guys were the enemy, or guys who looked like him were the enemy, yesterday, essentially. So that became part of the balance. And I love how he's become sort of the conscience and a bit of the comic relief in the stories. And yeah, he is Katz's best friend.
That kind of balances out the relationship with Kats and Molly, doesn't it? Having the third person there to kind of buffer that, and so their relationship, they seem pretty tight, but it says, from what I've read that it's going to get a little complicated in a Midnight Climax.
Well, they are, again, imagine.
Don't spill the beans.
No, I won't spill the beans. But interracial marriage or interracial relationships were still provocative, in the 1950s, and onwards even. And you did see, Asians and Caucasians together, but most of the time it was a Caucasian man with an Asian woman, the whole war bride.
Oh, yeah.
Thing. So seeing an Asian man with a white woman was kind of transgressive at the time. And my parents, they talked a little bit about that, of what it was like for them. And they were, they met and they, fell in love, got married in Ohio. So yeah, you can imagine perhaps even more conservative in that sense. So yeah, using, sort of that sort of as a backdrop and that kind of friction, to tell stories, how we have things in common. We're different, in some ways, but we're far more alike in most of the important ways.
I think also Kats, as his character too, being a veteran too, right? And then also his kind of work is he's seeing things that are hard to digest.
They didn't call it PTSD back then. They would have called it battle fatigue or shell shock. And Kats, no spoilers, Kats goes through a fairly traumatic, event in Europe. He does earn a Silver Star because of it. So he's clearly a brave guy, but, sometimes even those acts of bravery are, it's like it required, something catastrophic happened. And so we see in the first book, we have some of the hints of that sort of PTSD. We explore that a lot more in the second book, Midnight Climax, very much digs into that. And we actually meet the guy who was sort of the psychiatrist that Kats worked with during World War II. And he plays a very important role in the story that is set there in 1959, because he is treating another soldier who's gone through some amazing, I shouldn't say amazing, so he's gone through some hellish experiences. So it's a way for us to talk about something that is still important today, how we treat our veterans and PTSD and all of that.
Yeah, and understanding and the system is so hard for them, to navigate. It's like, I always say, when someone, goes through cancer or some kind of medical thing, heart disease, you name it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The worst part is the medical system. It's worse than the disease often, trying to understand what's going on, who to call, the insurance companies,
it's so confusing.
The red tape, the system is just not user friendly. And I think that's the same way for our veterans coming home. It's not easy. And then you have to, and then it's in your face too, if you do it, it's kind of like you have to acknowledge what's going on, and instead of being nudged to the helping side, you know what I mean? Nurtured.
Sometimes the hardest thing is simply, asking for help.
Mm-hmm.
And especially think about it, these veterans, most often you think of men who, have to be strong and brave and, hey, you're a soldier, you're a tough guy, to come back and say, I'm not right. That's got to be incredibly hard, to do. And I think we've gotten better over time, certainly. But we still probably have a long way to go.
Yeah, I think so. I think we do. I think, it's interesting with your novel too, your series, is that you're not taking us too far back in history. And at this time now, everyone's talking about, World War II era is, where they're leaving us now. It's time to go to the next plane. So we're missing some of that history, and it's important to get it out there while people are still here,
Yeah,
and so
true.
people can connect with, maybe their grandparents, Japanese or, non-Japanese, all sides, to have those connections and communications so that there's more understanding. And a story always makes it easier to have an understanding. Textbooks,
absolutely.
like you're saying, high school textbooks, it's like, and this happened and that happened, boom, period. It's like, what? We missed the story, and the history is the story of people,
Exactly. It's, history is, it's this complex. If you look at history as a story, I think you'd try to understand it in a different way. Instead, we teach history as you said, it's a collection of, facts and figures and dates, and names that don't really mean anything. But if you put them into a story, then you can understand, like, okay, what was it like to live in America, in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union launching Sputnik, which is sort of part of the backdrop of Hunter's Point, because Sputnik was launched in like October of 1957. And we think of this little tiny satellite. It's like, oh, big deal. They launched the satellite. But no, the point is they launched the very first one, and they beat us, the Americans, to it. And that was terrifying for folks. And again, so that's hard to relate in just a few sentences of dry history. But you put it into a story, then it justifies some of the bad actors in Hunter's Point. They're using that as sort of the excuse to do some other kind of bad things.
It is amazing. Yeah. I mean, and the history is repeating itself now too, isn't it? It's kind of crazy. So having this next book, both it's being in San Francisco as an urban planner. It's got to be, as a planner, but also understanding cities.
Yeah.
People have a being anti-San Francisco. The homelessness has always been there since I remember. I mean, we've been doing this for years, and it's, traveling the country full time. I'm sorry, I don't know anywhere who isn't having a problem with this. And that means our country has a problem. It's not, and I think a lot of homelessness comes from from what we've understood through, interviews with, people who work in that field, it's coming from, trauma. And
Trauma,
it,
addiction, mental illness,
addiction. And
lots
of
of
course,
stuff.
we've got,
Yes.
this opioid thing and fentanyl and
Yeah.
all of that. That's
Oh
really
yeah.
made things, it's insane. Um, I remember 2009, it was 2011 or 12. Yeah, we did an interview. And at that time, the average homeless person's age was 9 years old. And this
Weird.
was after, the 2008 crash. So it took
Yeah.
its toll on families. And so I think San Francisco's always had this bad rap for this. And at the same time, it's also
Yeah.
part of the character in a way of the city to me. It's part of the makeup. That's
Yeah.
just my personal experience. Like, personal thing is like, wouldn't go there, just like I wouldn't say I wouldn't go there over that. And people
Yeah.
do.
Honestly, I've been back to San Francisco multiple times in the last, couple of years. Yeah, there are places I would feel a little uncomfortable especially if I was, if I was a woman by myself. It's like, yeah, I probably
Sure.
wouldn't walk through the Tenderloin after
Yeah.
dark by
Oh, yeah,
myself.
yeah, yeah. No, no.
But during the day, you're fine. But the thing about I think the rap that San Francisco's gotten is because it's been, it's very visible, and also because in some ways San Francisco was the height of a lot of very positive urbanity. It was the center of the tech industry, of wealth, and it was the gateway to the Pacific and to Asia. All this stuff. San Francisco has this amazing sort of reputation, and then when you see that there's sort of like, and here's some really negative stuff there, and I think it's a bit of that. It's like, well, maybe it wasn't all that. And so I think San Francisco is all, the light has always shown very brightly on them. And now that they are having problems, it's also shining very brightly on those problems. Will San Francisco get through this? Yes, they will. It's still an amazing city. They will figure it out. And again, once they figure it out, I think they become maybe the leading edge of like how other cities can figure it out. Because you're absolutely right. It's not just a San Francisco problem. It's not a California problem.
Oh,
It's a
no.
national problem.
It absolutely is. I mean, there's not one city. I mean, we were in Madison, Wisconsin, and
Hmm.
I saw, homeless people in the snow.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how are you doing this?
Yeah.
I'm still cold inside, how, it's something, and I'm not knocking Madison. Madison's awesome. Madison
Oh yeah.
rocks, but
This is great.
it's just, this is a national problem.
Yes.
And I think people go where they can be warm, except for in Madison. I don't know, like, yeah, how do you just get out of there? If you're stuck there, you're stuck. Um, so it's complicated, but it is part of our history as a country too. And I think a lot of the homelessness started with veterans coming
Yes.
home from Vietnam and even from World War II, and the Korean War, and um,
Even from
you
World
know,
War One, actually.
even
So
that, really, wow.
I mean, we get the World War One ends, and what happens almost immediately after that is the Spanish flu. The Spanish
Yeah,
flu made COVID look like, the sniffles by comparison. The Spanish flu was several times more lethal in terms of, people dying from the infection. So there was a lot of stuff that's always happened. And then, we have the so-called Roaring Twenties, and then the crash. And then, you have the Depression, when homelessness becomes sort of literally becomes the national identity of people losing their jobs, losing their homes.
yeah,
All
yeah. Look at the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, the Dust
Everybody,
Bowl.
California was settled. The farming country. Part of that is, multiple immigrants
Yes,
coming in. I mean, it's like Tulare County, Central California Valley, San Joaquin Valley,
yeah,
that area. If you look at the multiple cultures, there's a
yes,
museum in Visalia, California, that showcases all the people involved in agriculture. It goes from Armenia to the Hmong people.
yeah.
Um, they don't even have their own country anymore. It's just so diverse, which is something to celebrate, really.
Mhm.
Diversity is good. It means we all have good food. But at that time, when the Dust Bowl happened, that everyone was homeless doing that. And
Yeah.
and I believe it's actually illegal to be homeless, which is weird. You know. So I don't.
I don't know maybe
It's
it was back then. I don't know. It's not illegal to be homeless now. There's all kinds
really,
of, no, it's not, yeah, it's not illegal to be homeless. The
huh, I
condition
always
that
thought it was.
the condition means that you can't basically, if somebody's sleeping on the street, you can't arrest them in most places now. If there is, unless there is a place for them to go, you have to have, homeless shelters. You have to have a bed for them somewhere. And
Hmm,
that's been the major problem in California, especially in San Francisco, who've not been able to build anywhere near the amount of housing or affordable housing that is necessary.
hmm,
So under the current under current law, you can't arrest people for being homeless
hmm.
uh, unless have a place for them to go. And frankly, there's not a place for them to go, especially in Northern California.
Hmm. In Midnight Climax, when you delved into this whole thing that the CIA were doing with, the
Yeah,
psychedelics and then
yeah.
all of these different testings, right? And at the same time, psychedelics were
Hmm.
becoming out, coming out at that time too. Do you
Psychedelics were
think,
legal at that time. LSD was legal until the mid 60s. Did you know that?
dang,
Yeah.
no, I didn't. Didn't.
Yeah.
So all this stuff's going on, the shenanigans are happening, but I bet that led to some homelessness too at the end of it, if
Well, we have
people,
there's a little vignette in the story where Kats and his friends come across a couple of guys who are, they you call them homeless today, unhoused. And they have a little incident that actually resolves, I think, in an interesting way. Um, Yeah. Again, the homeless have been part of our country, as you say, from the very beginning.
mm,
It's just now, we have, ways to document it, and it's all over your Facebook or your Instagram feed.
mm.
It just seems more visible now.
In Midnight Climax, there's a murder of a young Chinese girl in this.
Hmm.
And so now Katz is, going to go investigate that. So that it's cool because now you're going into Chinatown. So now we're getting
Yeah.
Chinatown and you're getting like mixed cultures again in this too, which is
Yeah.
interesting. So because, people, I want people to understand, everyone's different, but at the same time, we're all the same, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that had to be interesting writing that from
It
two different
was.
perspectives.
Especially
Yeah.
because, the Japanese and the Chinese historically have not gotten along very well.
Yeah.
There's a lot and that dates back to, a lot of stuff happened in, centuries ago. But, just because, we tend to look at, the Asian community, it's like there's differences. The Japanese are very different than the Chinese. And the Chinese are not even just the Chinese. There are Chinese who are, from the southern China, Chinese from northern China, the Chinese who never were from China, who came from Southeast Asia. So all these, these different sort of permutations, that no group is a monolith. And so it was interesting to sort of write that because I knew about these sort of differences between the sort of the Japanese and Chinese. Growing up as a kid, I was kind of aware of that. The only other kids that looked anything like me there's a few Chinese kids in my school when I was growing up,
Mhm.
and they were friends of mine, but I knew they came from a different sort of culture than I did.
Mm. I had both friends, and growing up in South Africa, um,
Yeah, there you
and
go.
in Kenya when we lived there, but in school, yeah, I remember, yeah, both,
Hmm.
yeah, both industrious people, very, smart as all get out, man. And, I
Asian.
just thinking the
Yeah.
two sides, yeah, yeah, but different,
I make
and different cultures. I remember my one friend Brad, going to his house. His parents were still incredibly from the mother country, basically,
hmm.
and so they had pretty much just moved there. And I mean, the food, the things they were growing and eating, I had no clue what was going on. It was like a kitchen, to me, looking at them. I was an American kid, but mostly raised in Africa, but I'm looking at what they had, like things floating around in jars and going,
Yeah.
what is this? Do you have an aquarium going on? And I
They're
just
gonna
didn't
eat
have
that?
any
Yeah.
clue. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but they did. And hey, they're healthy, man. And so it was really fascinating for me to learn, and they were very open and welcoming and just I don't know, just had really good friends.
Yeah,
It was cool. You don't care as kids without all the stuff that comes with history and
exactly.
all of that, unless you're taught to be that way,
Yeah,
which I wasn't,
yeah.
so we just, yeah, and
Well, we
uh,
should take a lesson from, kids like that to be open, be curious, not judgmental, to quote, the great uh,
yeah.
uh,
I went to a
Ted
multiracial
Lasso.
school.
Yeah.
They call it multiracial international school in Kenya as a little kid and actually got kicked out, but that's a whole other story. But it was Snow White. Nancy, was it Snow White? Yeah, yeah. It was a multicultural school, and I was the only white kid, and I
Hmm.
got nailed, man. I'm just saying, I got it. It was mostly different black tribes and Indians, and
Hmm.
man, but did they teach me like I? They taught me math like you wouldn't believe, and um, yeah. But and then I did get kicked out because the Minister of Home Affairs' son kept hitting me, and I hit him back, and I didn't know it was the Minister of Home Affairs' son. But he didn't know what I was because I was
Politics.
like the only white kid. I was the
Yeah.
only white kid, and I had long hair, blonde hair, and you know, in his tribe, the Maasai, the men braid their hair really long with clay
Hmm.
and mud and everything,
Yeah, yeah.
and their hair. And so he's looking when the moms, the mothers, women shave their heads. So he's like, "What are you?" He was lifting my shirt to see if I had boobs. We were like 5 years old or something, 5, 6 years old. And he would spit on me, which is actually a blessing. Like, I don't know what the heck you are. So I'm spitting on you,
Huh.
to protect myself. And so he started hitting me on my head to make me shorter. And I turned around and it smacked him back. And then Nancy, my mom, got a call saying, you need to take Lisa out of school. And then I ended up in a convent getting my knuckles whacked. So there you
By
go.
the Catholic, yeah, yeah. My dad went to a Catholic school in San Francisco, and they rapped on it. My dad was naturally left-handed. They rapped on his knuckles until he learned how to write with his right hand. So yeah,
Are you kidding me? That's wild.
yeah,
Wow. Yeah. So the knuckle thing's real. They used to put your hands under water,
yeah.
cold water, and do it. Yeah. Don't mess with nuns ever.
Apparently
And
not.
no, no, no. Wow. Well, I think we've gone around the world a little bit today and across
Yes,
the
we have.
country. We've
Yeah.
been to what? We've been to Florida. We've been to San Francisco, Utah. Have you been to Manzanar?
I have not been to Manzanar.
Oh,
I need to
yeah.
go. Yes.
That's part of our National Park Service.
Yeah.
And that was one of the internment camps. And
Yeah.
we've been there, but not done at all what we want to do. In fact, I wouldn't even put it as anything that we've done. Um, but it's amazing because we've driven in and you can see the different buildings, but
Yeah.
they also had an extensive garden. No matter what was going on, there was this resilience. And
Yes.
that, the Eastern Sierras that's cold, man. When
Yeah.
that's cold, it's cold, but they were resilient and,
Yeah. These were
planted
not
things. I
heated
mean,
campsites at all. So yeah.
no, but how they did, yeah, the buildings I'm talking about, that wasn't like cozy homes. Um, yeah, it's the resilience of
Hmm.
people is something to look up to and aspire to be like, as things get wonky in our world. But thank you so much for joining us, Peter.
My
When's
pleasure,
the
Lisa.
next one?
The
When's the
next
next
one.
one?
I'm working on it right now. The last two have come out in January of 2023, January 2024. I'd say it's a pretty good, it's nice to have a sort of self-imposed deadline. It's like, I think January of 2025 would be a good time for book three. I'm going to do my best. So, yeah.
Did you think that you were going to do a series, or did you think it was going to be a one-off novel?
No, after I finished the first book, I really fell in love with the characters and knew I wanted to come back and revisit them. And also, if you think about San Francisco entering the 1960s, it's like that's a really rich
Oh,
backdrop to play against. Did anything interesting happen in San Francisco in the 60s? Like, oh yeah, quite a bit.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, expect more of that. So
Cool, cool.
yeah,
You got to have wavy gravy in there, man. So
absolutely.
everyone, Peter Kageyama is the website to go to peterkageyama.com. The book is Midnight Climax. It is out now. You can get it anywhere you buy books, and try your independent bookstores too. And if they don't have it, ask them to order it.
Yes, please.
Bookshop.org. Are you on there too? I know
I,
Amazon, all that.
all that, yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.